Before we make videos on many Napoleonic battles, I'd like to set the stage with this video, showing exactly who Napoleon was and how he came to be. I'm Griffin Johnson, this is Armchair History. So firstly, Napoleon was born on the Italian island of Corsica in 1769. His father was part of an Italian noble family, but he wasn't wealthy. Napoleon had 8 siblings and struggled to get by on the small, impoverished island. In the beginning of Napoleon's childhood, Corsica had actually just come under French control, and his father supported the very rebels who fought against France. Ironically, at an early age, this would make Napoleon an enemy of France, the country he would go on to rule. Napoleon said, "I was born when Corsica was perishing. 30,000 Frenchmen spewed onto our shores, drowning in the throne of liberty in waves of blood. The cries of the dying, the groans of the oppressed, and tears of despair surrounded my cradle from the hour of my birth." As just a teenager, Napoleon was promoted in the Royal Military Academy in Paris after several years of dedication. Graduating early from the military academy, Napoleon, now an officer of artillery, returned to his homeland of Corsica. Before we continue with Napoleon's journey, I'd like to talk to you about the French Revolution, a huge part of Napoleon's rise to power. In the 1790s, tensions were high in France, as the country was on the verge of a revolution. Years of extravagant spending in previous wars had left the country on the brink of bankruptcy. The gap between the rich and the poor was at its peak. A grouping government challenged the nobility's right to rule, leading to a power struggle, and ultimately starting the revolution. Huge mobs would fill the streets of Paris. With fear that the King of France would retaliate in force, the mob stormed Bastille to obtain arms. In the end, King Louis XVI was executed for high treason at the guillotine, and the country was left extremely unstable with really no centralized leadership, besides a small council of revolutionary leaders. And threatened by these new absurd ideas of liberty, many of the monarchs of Europe sent armies against France in what was called the First Coalition, as an attempt to restore the monarchy. This was to prevent the idea of a republic from spreading to many of these monarchies in Europe, much how like the United States would invade Korea and Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. And right as many of these armies are beginning to invade France, let's switch back to Napoleon. He was still a lieutenant, but this time of great prestige. In 1795, he saved the revolutionary government in Paris from pro-king loyalist forces who attempted to put the nobility back in power. For this effort, he received the rank of brigadier general and commander of the Army of the Interior. Following, he was put in command of the Army of Italy, and under Napoleon's command, his army came out victorious against the Italians and Austrians. He went so far as to advance onto Vienna, and ensuing, the Austrians signed the Treaty of Campo Formio, which granted France most of northern Italy. So by this time, the French government was still in charge by a revolutionary council called the Directory, and Napoleon was gaining huge amounts of influence in this unstable form of government by his number of victories on the field. And so in 1797, Napoleon conquested in Egypt, still just a general under France. This was an attempt to disrupt English trade routes to India, but the campaign ultimately ended in failure, as the French Navy lost the crucial Battle of the Nile, disabling the French from continuing on. Why was this significant? Well, it shows the French Navy didn't have the same dominance it had on land, and the loss in Egypt motivated Britain, Austria, Russia, and the Ottomans in 1798 to form another coalition to restore the nobility in France. Just a while later, in 1799, Napoleon helped overthrow the Directory Council in France with his newly gained influence as a military commander. This meant Napoleon was named First Consul, or head of the government, sort of similar to a prime minister or a president, but if the president had completely unchecked powers. As the nations of Europe were still fighting against France, he marched his army back into Italy and defeated the Austrians again in the important Battle of Marengo. The second coalition was then dismantled in the first years of 1800. Right after that, Napoleon named himself consul for life, and later emperor. It really shows the irony of the French Revolution, as Napoleon pretty much became another king. And if you're confused why they would settle for another king-like figure, remember that Napoleon is the only one in France able to beat the armies in Europe who are trying to destroy the revolution. On top of this, Napoleon passed several laws which were very liberal for the time, closing some of the gap between the rich and the poor. Coalition after coalition, Napoleon was destroying the armies of these countries banding against him. By 1805, much of Europe was under his control. But that same year, in the Battle of Trafalgar, his navy was destroyed by the same man who destroyed his navy in Egypt early in his career, Horatio Nelson. Luckily for Napoleon, his opponent Nelson would be killed in this naval battle. Unluckily, Napoleon lost his navy, meaning England was one of the only powers in Europe that was completely safe from France. Later that year of 1805, Napoleon made up for his loss at sea with a victory at Austerlitz. This battle, and many others following, would put an end to the Third Coalition formed. And at this point, Napoleon really viewed himself as invincible, as his empire engulfed many states within Europe. More victories and more coalitions would follow as Napoleon continued his conquest of Europe. Napoleon would install loyalist governments across the continent, and to assure his control over them, he appointed relatives and generals to lead them. With his only real targets left of Britain and Russia, Napoleon sought to close all ports of Europe from trading with Britain in hopes to starve them out. To make this possible, he established what was called the Continental System. This meant every country in Europe, most under France, had to transport goods via land rather than at sea. Spain was one of the only major countries who ignored this, and so Napoleon began what was called the Peninsular Campaign against Spain, Portugal, and Britain. This lasted from 1808 to 1814, and actually ended up outlasting Napoleon's reign. Though Napoleon claimed control of Spain, he lost the Peninsula Campaign, not just by means of conventional warfare, but primarily in the means of occupied resistance. The Spanish guerrillas, or irregular fighters, were bands of men who moved in secret across the countryside to ambush French armies, a system of warfare used in Vietnam, the American Revolution, and throughout the modern wars in the Middle East. As Napoleon had his armies attempt to hold down Spain, he noticed in 1812 Emperor Alexander of Russia stopped using the continental trade system and opened up trade again with Britain. Napoleon would then launch one of his most disastrous and ambitious campaigns of his lifetime. It began with great victories such as the Battle of Borodino, but as the French lost most of their supplies on the march for the Russian capital, they needed to reach Moscow quickly to restock. The French were able to take it, but upon arrival, the city had been scorched. Months passed, and Napoleon began his journey back to France as winter set in. Russians would repeat similar tactics used by the Spanish guerrillas by harassing the French army as they retreated. Of the original 600,000 men under Napoleon Bonaparte, only 10,000 men were fit for combat by the time Napoleon returned to Paris. And with confidence brought back to the many subjugated powers in Europe, in 1814 Paris fell to the Sixth Coalition, made up of Russia, Prussia, Austria, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Sicily, Sardinia, and later many of the German states. Napoleon was finally beat, and was exiled to the island of Elba. Louis XVIII was placed on the French throne, and that was the end of Napoleon. But not really, as only a year later Napoleon escaped Elba, took control from Louis, and was back at war. The nations of Europe formed a seventh coalition to eject Napoleon for the final time. Their fight against Napoleon was called the 100 Days Campaign, in which Napoleon initially won the first few engagements he fought in. But in the decisive Battle of Waterloo, the combined armies of Britain and Prussia defeated him for the very last time. Napoleon would be placed on St. Helena this time, an island far away from any continental land. He spent the rest of his life on this island, dying to cancer at the age of 51. But not really, as Napoleon escaped from St. Helena again, not physically, but his ideas did. As Napoleon's legacy left a stain in Europe through ideas of individual liberties. Though Napoleon seemed like a tyrannical dictator in many ways, several of the laws he imposed on his nation were very liberal. The monarchs in Europe would remain at peace for several decades after this war, but the seed of liberty was planted into the grounds of Europe and the world. Thank you for listening. Please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Nearly all comments will be replied to, so don't be afraid to ask any questions. Be sure to check us out on Twitter, and to make videos like this possible, support the show on Patreon. With each donation, new goals can be met to make our channel better than ever. The links are in the description. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time.